Now, the head of the United Nations has warned that the world is gridlocked by a string of crises. Secretary General Antonio Guterres told the UN General Assembly in New York that countries are not willing to tackle problems, including the war in Ukraine and climate change. He warned of a global winter of discontent, saying developing nations are facing a dire financial situation too. Guterres also said the world is falling short on goals of tackling poverty and improving education. And he says solutions must be found without delay.
We need action across the board. Let's have no illusions. We are in rough seas. A winter of global discontent is on the horizon. A cost of living crisis is raging. Trust is crumbling. Inequalities are exploding. And our planet is burning. People are hurting, with the most vulnerable suffering the most.
UN Chief Antonio Guterres speaking there. And we can now talk to our Washington Bureau Chief, Ines Paul, who is in New York City. And I'm joined here in the studio by Richard Walker, our Chief International Editor. But let's start in New York, where the action is happening with Ines. We heard Guterres there appealing for less division in the world to tackle the world's major crises. So what is his main message here?
Right, Gerhard, so he talked about, as expected, about Ukraine, which has, the war in Ukraine, which has, as we know, left thousands dead and brought the world at the brink of a nuclear war, but he didn't leave it there. He really drew a broader picture. He talked a lot about climate change, the climate catastrophe. He talked a lot about inequality, really always stressing the fact that those who are already the most disadvantaged are the most vulnerable as well. And it wouldn't be Secretary General Guterres if he wouldn't kind of leave us with a hopeful note, saying that if all democracies, if everybody comes together, there is still a possibility for good change, but he definitely didn't leave any doubt that time is running out.
Richard, what's your main takeaway from that speech?
Yeah, well, certainly there were some optimistic messages in there, but I would also kind of counterpoint with a little bit of what you see is almost the trend of the speeches that the Guterres has been making in the last several years. You know, he's been in his role for several years now. And year after year, every September, he comes to this UN General Assembly, you know, the podium where you can address the entire world. And his message every year has been getting kind of darker. I mean, 2 years ago, he said, people are hurting. Last year, he said, I'm here to sound the alarm. The world must wake up. And this year, there's a sense the world hasn't woken up. And he started with his very first words in his speech were, our world is in big trouble. So I do get the impression of a man who has this very prominent role in global diplomacy, who has, you know, he sees the entire gamut of crises facing the world. This gamut is getting greater every single year. He's trying to sound that alarm ever louder every single year. And yet, as he puts it, we are gridlocked in global dysfunction.
Ines, the General Assembly is always a chance for bilateral talks as well on their sides. Who's talking to whom? What are you expecting there?
It's a very important time for really the world leaders to meet in bilateral talks, and especially after last year's kind of COVID UNGA, where many world leaders couldn't attend in person. It is interesting to know that Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz is meeting pretty much right now with the Turkish President Erdogan. And that is interesting. It's always interesting, but especially today, because Erdogan just gave an interview to an American radio station saying that he expects Russia to give back the occupied territories like Crimea. And that is interesting because Erdogan on the one side also just said last week that he wants to intensify the trade connections to China and Russia. So we definitely will listen into that and hear what Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, will have to say about this bilateral talk.
Now, Guterres also addressed the issue of climate change. Let's have a quick listen.
The climate crisis is the defining issue of our time. And it must be the first priority of every government and multilateral organization. And yet, climate climate action is being put on the back burner, despite overwhelming public support around the world.
Now, Ines, the issue of climate change really brought forward with urgency there. Guterres also stressed the imbalances between different parts of the world there. What did he have to say about those?
Did you address this to me or to Richard? I didn't quite hear you.
That was a question to you.
Very loud here. I'm sorry.
That was a question to you, of course. Let me just repeat this. It is about what Guterres actually said about climate change.
Yeah, well, he really draw a very dramatic picture, as Richard just also said it a little earlier. He said we are in a rendezvous with the devil and that there is hardly any time left. So he really wants to address, or he told actually the world leaders that they should listen to their people, because Guterres is convinced that the majority of the average people already understand the dramatical situation we are in here. He wants more money. He wants structural changes, and I think his main message really here was today, people, the world is in big trouble, we have to face the Ukrainian war, but this climate catastrophe, this war against time must not be forgotten.
Richard, can we expect any substantial outcome from this General Assembly in regard to any of the crisis points that we've mentioned?
Well, we've heard about some of the proposals that Guterres is putting forward there. We've also heard about the kind of frustration that he feels. But I think one notable thing is that although the UN General Assembly is back as an in-person event here, some of the really major leaders are not taking part. Vladimir Putin, perhaps not surprising, he's waging a war. But Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, he is not here. Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, also not taking part on location in New York. And I think that that's a bit of a sign also of the fact that the UN system is really struggling to deal with what Guterres describes here, of this huge division in the world, that if not only Vladimir Putin, but Xi Jinping is not showing up to meetings like this, what kind of progress can you really expect on these big issues?
DW's Chief International Editor Richard Walker and our Washington Bureau Chief Ines Paul there in New York. Thank you to you both. Now, and you can watch the entire UN General Assembly on our YouTube channel. That's DW News on YouTube.